Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Anne Alexander is hunted by a whale?
Here we are. Enjoy!
What a commentator is this Anne Alexander whale. What he has to say is short and pithy, and very much to the point. I wonder if my evil art has raised this monster, said Herman Melville. He could hardly be blamed for seeing the connection between the story being splashed internationally across the newspapers and the novel he had been writing, Moby Dick. In a few months, he would be ready to publish, and he would certainly hope that yet another ship being sank by a whale would make his book of more interest to the reading public. Before, the only example of a whale sinking a whaler was the famous Essex. Now, the Anne Alexander had reminded everyone that hunting whales had the ever-present chance of becoming the hunted. The Anne Alexander was part of a huge industry that employed a large portion of the seafaring men in New England and provided resources all over the nation. Places like New Bedford, Massachusetts, sent out fleets of whaling ships every year to bring back barrels of whale oil. It was an industry that had made New Bedford the most wealthy city in North America, and one of the most wealthy cities per capita in the world. The oil that came into the city on their ships became lantern oil, candles, soap, and paint, things used by the whole nation. As such a large industry, it was completely without note when the Anne Alexander left Massachusetts on June 1st, 1850. She was just one of a fleet of over 50 ships that left New Bedford every year to hunt whales. By the time that the Anne Alexander rounded Cape Horn to cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific, they already had 500 barrels of oil. The only thing to note from this part of their voyage that made it of interest at all was that they had lost one of their sailors overboard in a storm while rounding the Horn. They stopped in Chile to pick up a new sailor as a replacement, and then headed to the offshore grounds as they were known, a popular Pacific hunting ground. When a pod of the much sought-after sperm whales was seen in the distance, both the starboard and the larboard ships were launched to begin the hunt. The captain, Captain de Blois, took charge of the starboard boat, and the first mate took charge of the larboard boat. It would be the larboard boat with the first mate who would strike the first blow. It took a good deal of effort to take down something as large as a whale. Such a battle could be considered a war of attrition, counting not only on javelins and harpoons, but also on wearing the creature out until it could no longer struggle. Therefore, when the whale was initially struck by the harpoon and started to swim away, it was an expected result, and the boats gave chase. It was far less expected when the whale suddenly rounded on the larboard boat. The giant sperm whale took the small boat in its jaws and crushed it into pieces. The captain and the crew of the starboard boat, seeing their men in the water, rowed as quickly as they could to offer aid. It was considered miraculous that though the men from the larboard boat were shaken and surprised, all had survived and were uninjured. The Anne Alexander crew still on the ship, seeing the larboard boat get destroyed, immediately launched the waste boat to help carry the men from the now overloaded starboard boat. The men quickly divided themselves into two boats, and thinking that such an unusual attack was not likely to be repeated, they resumed the hunt of the injured whale. The whale seemed to have learned how to deal with them, however. Not only that, but it seemed to know what boat had injured it. This time, rather than attempting to escape the hunters, it immediately rounded on the waste boat and smashed to pieces just as it had the larboard boat. This time, the men in the boat reacted faster as well, and they dove into the water as the whale took their small boat in his mouth. Once again, the captain on the starboard boat sprang into action, and they were able to once again reach the men in the water before any of them drowned. With this, it became clear that they were going to need to change their approach, especially since the starboard boat was now severely overloaded. In the hunt, they had gone about 6 miles from the Anne Alexander, and so they had a long, hard row in their heavily laden boat to get back. Once back on board the Anne Alexander, they sent a boat to go fetch the oars from the smashed boats, which were still floating on the sea, and tried to plan their next attack. It did not seem like a good idea to face the whale in small boats again, but with every barrel of oil being valuable profits, they did not want to abandon the hunt of the injured whale either. Instead, it was decided that the best course of action would be to chase the whale with the Anne Alexander. The whale, which did not chase them as they rowed away, now once more was injured, this time by a lance from the deck of the Anne Alexander. Angered, it once more made a charge for them, but on seeing him coming, they quickly changed the course of the ship, causing him to pass them by. By the time they had repositioned themselves to attack him again, they discovered that he had now settled into deep water where their attacks could not reach him. They had started their hunt around noon, and night was now falling. Exhausted and defeated, they decided to give up the chase. The whale did not share this feeling. As it grew dark, a feeling that was described as though they had been run aground was described as shaking the entire ship. The captain rushed from the deck to the hold below, only to find that the water was rushing in. The whale, in one last act of spite, had used its head to stave in their ship below the waterline. Captain de Blois quickly gave his orders. If there was to be any chance of saving the ship, they were going to need to get rid of their heavy pig iron ballast and the iron anchors that they had on deck. His men did their best to act quickly, but even as they cut away an anchor, it was becoming more and more clear that the Anne Alexander was doomed. Telling his men to gather what they could to provision the ship's boats, Captain de Blois went below once again, this time with the intention of grabbing charts and navigation instruments from his cabin to help them find their way. However, he was thwarted by the water that was rushing into the ship. With the ship now sinking beneath them, the men got into the remaining ship's boats and got ready to row away. Captain de Blois was the last man on board the ship, waiting to see that the boats were launched safely before he himself jumped from the deck into the sea below and swam to one of the boats. Once they had all safely evacuated the ship and taken stock, a new realization was made. In the rush to leave the ship, and with the water pouring in, they had no provisions other than a very small amount of water. Their boats were also the ones left over from their unsuccessful whale hunt earlier that day, and they were all so leaky that they needed constant bailing out. Out of necessity, the next morning, they returned to the scene of the sinking ship to see what they could salvage. The ship was on beam ends, dragged over by the weight of her masts. They would not be able to do anything until she was righted. But the sailors feared that as soon as the masts were cut, she might sink. The captain, finding that there were no volunteers, scrambled on board himself and started to cut away the mast. The captain managed to arm himself with a hatchet, and with this he chopped down the main mast. As the mast fell, the ship began to right itself. Now, more convinced that the ship would not immediately sink beneath their feet, the rest of the crew joined him on the deck, and they chopped down the foremast, releasing the last of the weight that was causing the ship to wallow on her side. They were now able to stand on the little part of the ship that was still above water and take stock. There was nothing that would be useful to them on the deck, so they chopped holes in the deck to reach what was below. The hold was full of water, but tying ropes around their waists to help prevent them from drowning, the men of the Anne Alexander's crew still went in, hoping they would be able to salvage something. What they were able to find, however, did not fill anyone with much hope. They came away with a 20-pound barrel of wet bread and a 5-pound barrel of vinegar. With the ship not offering them any more to live on, and in danger of sinking at any moment, they left the Anne Alexander and returned to the boats. Though the Essex had happened 30 years before, the whaling ship sank by a whale, with its crew descending into cannibalism in the end, was very much in the minds of the men as they drifted across the waves. The newspapers had covered the Essex internationally, and the whaling community still spoke of it, one of the most extreme examples of the dangers of their job. The men of the Anne Alexander, with only 20 pounds of wet bread to live on, could only hope that they would be saved before they could also become such a story. They would prove to be luckier than the Essex. After only 2 days of drifting, they saw the Nantucket of the same city in the distance. The Nantucket whaling ship, seeing them waving it down, took them from the water and treated them the best they could. The Nantucket did attempt salvage of some of the Anne Alexander, but just as the crew before them, they came away empty-handed. The seas were too rough to stay too close to the wreck, and most of the valuables were already under water or had washed away. Instead, the Nantucket turned towards Chile to bring survivors once more to dry land. Once in Chile, the crews scattered, all to make their own ways back to New Bedford, whether paying for their voyage as passengers or finding a new berth on a different ship headed in that direction. The story was not over yet, and the public could not get enough of it. This was only the second time that anyone could recall a whale charging a ship to sink it. The story also had an epilogue. The Rebecca Sims, also a whaling vessel, reported 5 months later that it had hunted and killed a whale that had 2 harpoons sticking out of it, the timbers still lodged in its head from the Anne Alexander. It had not put up such a fight for them, but it also had suffered from infection from its wounds, so maybe its ship-killing days were over. Still, the public was primed and ready to embrace Melville's book, Moby Dick, when it was published only a few months after the sinking of the Anne Alexander. They were all ready to read of a whale and a captain circling and hunting one another across the sea. For more information, please see the Sydney Morning Herald from Saturday, the 20th of March, 1852, or see the rest of our sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.